Hello, all. Okay, this is going to be chapter 15, Agenda Setting and Political Discourse. So, some of this touches on like this stuff we covered in chapter 8 about, I don't know, meaning, words, these sorts of things, but it's about discourse, right? And so, chapter 15 is by David Rochefort and Kevin Connolly. We'll jump straight into 15.1, the intro. And they basically say there's three questions that we can sort of try to analyze when it comes to agenda setting, right? First, among all the competing concerns of individuals and groups, what determines which one will succeed in gaining the active attention of political decision makers? Two, how do problems and solutions come to be matched together in public policy formulation? And three, who are the key actors in agenda setting and by what means do they pursue their objectives? And then we move on and ask what reduces the likelihood of a small group of actors monopolizing policymaking and agenda setting, right? We've touched on this numerous times in the course, in that sort of agenda setting, policymaking, et cetera, tends to be rather elitist, often is sort of monopolized by an entrenched group, right? And so, how do we reduce their power over time, right? And so the first is high visibility of the social problem or social ill or whatever it might be, right? When the public is very much tapped in, this reduces the power of these sort of entrenched groups, right? Second, greater social significance. So the more, this touches on higher visibility, but it's also just like how much does this problem that we've defined touch on the broader community in general, right? And if it's more particularized, you're going to get more power from that sort of entrenched elitist group. When it's more sort of spread among the population, like, say, I don't know, gas prices, right? Then those groups are going to have less power, those sort of entrenched policymaking groups. And then finally is greater levels of controversy, right? The more people are out there debating, the more controversial it is, the less power those entrenched groups are going to have. And so this chapter focuses on sort of the argumentative turn, or what they call the critical role of discourse within this disorderly process of agenda setting. And it will focus on three particular areas of discourse. First, problem definition. Second, framing. And third, what is the political narrative? Okay, we'll move on to section 15.2, where they offer a really nice review of the literature moving from basically 1960 all the way to the mid 2010s. And so Schneider, the same guy we talked about in the last chapter, wrote a very famous book called The Semi-Sovereign People, right? And this was the title of the book is a big criticism about our democratic processes, right? And he basically says mobilization of bias is the focus of his entire book. And it's about determining which concerns get organized into and out of the political game, right? And much of this focus from this book is on public opinion and how public opinion sort of drives narratives, framing, agenda setting, all of this stuff, okay? The second sort of addition to Schneider is Cobb and Elder from 1972. And they basically focus in their piece on what are the characteristics um, of an issue and how does that relate to longer term success, right? And so they offer a breakdown of five different characteristics of an issue: ambiguity and abstraction, social significance, long term relevance, lack of technical complexity, right? Engineering and nuclear, whatever, all this very highly technical stuff, like the population isn't really going to be able to keep up in general. And then fifth is familiarity to the population, right? And these things all lead to sort of greater salience, greater visibility, and in general, going back to sort of Schneider, um, an increased likelihood of sort of reducing the power of those entrenched elitists. Okay, we move on from there to a famous piece by Rochefort and Cobb, or two famous pieces, honestly, from 93 and 94. And they offer 5 areas of discussion that are constantly arising in political debate, right? And it's important to sort of break these down in the sense that the more well known they are, the more that we can approach them empirically, right? So as we define and as we categorize, it allows for greater empirical study, right? And so they say there's 5 main areas. Problem causation, right? The second is what is the nature of the problem itself? And they actually break this down into 5 subcategories of severity, incidence, like how often does it happen, novelty, proximity, right? If it's going on in Afghanistan, like why are we concerned about it, right? Or if it's only to be found in, say, I don't know, Oregon or something, like why are we as a nation considering this problem? Um, and then crisis status, right? Is it a crisis? As we learned before, crises generally draw eyeballs, right? Okay. The third area of discussion is characteristics of the problem population, right? So, uh, are we talking about homelessness? Are we talking about uh, the wealth gap between black and white? Are we talking about women's versus men's rights issues? These sorts of things, right? The fourth is ends mean orientation of the problem definer. So, sort of almost touches on the cost benefit analysis perspective. How is the problem definer conceptualizing the ends and the means, right? And then number 5, what is the nature of the solution itself? Okay, so we move on from there to Hirschman in 1991. So these are kind of going on at the same time. And Hirschman basically says, okay, yeah, we're talking about agenda setting, we're talking about the mass population, but we also need to understand in a greater detail how elites tend to counter uh, this idea that we need change, right? And how do they counter that to support the status quo as is, right? And they offer basically 3 approaches that political elites use to try and tamp down this concept of we need change, right? So the first is the portrayal of whatever change it might be as perverse, right? It's likely to backfire. It is morally untenable, these sorts of things. The second is the portrayal of change as futile, right? Government simply can't solve this. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes it's not, right? And then third, elites tend to portray changes as jeopardizing the system, right? It's going to damage some existing policy or the government system as a whole, etc. Okay, so we'll move on to the next couple of sections. We just talked about problem definition. We'll talk about framing, right? And I think we've discussed before. Framing is inevitably a simplification of reality, right? Yeah, we have discussed this before, right? Science, journalism, whatever it might be. You literally cannot just give every idiosyncratic version of how these things play out, right? You have to build sort of a model to simplify the broader world, right? And this inevitability, in many senses, leaves room for propaganda, for shaping public opinion, all of these sorts of things, right? And so this brings in Druckmann's famous 2010 piece on the types of application of framing, right? And so he's got a couple questions that he wants to answer. First, how does an individual form preferences, right? And we've sort of talked about this before when we were talking about like you have this hierarchy of preferences, you have this hierarchical model of the world that you've developed over time as an individual, whether it be based on, I don't know, religion, lived experience, some sense of ethics, whatever it might be, right? And basically, he says that this is a rank ordering of a set of objects or alternative actions, right? So we have to, of course, there are multiple ways we can approach things, and individuals tend to rank order um, which would be best for them, right? And rank ordering just means it's just like numerical ordering, except there's no numerical value, right? It's just this is better than this one, but it's not like 1, 2, 3, 4, where everything is equally distributed. Um, we're just putting them in order, right? There's no numerical differentiation between them, right? Okay. The second question that Druckmann wants to answer is what is the role of framing in political communication, right? Um, and the chapter touches on, and I would like to touch on the fact that much of this framing stuff is very elitist and top-down driven, right? The media tells us what to think, political elites tell us what to think, right? And in many senses, it's not the public telling politicians, etc., this is the direction we want to go. It's the elites at the top telling us this is how you need to think about this problem, right? And there are competing versions of that, but this is a very top-down sort of perspective. Okay, section 15.4, narrative. So what is the definition of narrative? These are devices that bring order and meaning to a situation. So in a sense, this is like a model, right? And there are numerous influences on narratives, and they list 5 here. You have metaphors, you have symbols, which we talked about in the former chapter, you have analogies, you have synecdoche, right? Let's call this little piece uh, the whole, right? Or let's call the whole a little piece, right? You make these sort of connections between the two. And then fifth, you have figurative language. So all of these linguistic terms and these linguistic techniques, categorizations, I don't know how to sort of say that, but they're all influences on what is the narrative, right? And we have 4 potential components of a narrative. You have who are the actors, right? And they point out here that their special prominence is tended to be given to victims, villains, and heroes, right? This is, you can even find this in like fiction writing, right? Like it's pretty rare that books are just about like normal everyday shit, right? Like generally there's a victim, there's a villain, there's a hero. We attach to these sort of grander perspectives of human life, right? Okay, the second is what is the point of view? And they say this is the speaker's perspective on what is important, true, worthy of comment, and what goes without saying, right? The third is about the sequential ordering of events, right? About causality. And they say it gives coherence to a problem's origins and then its development over time, right? And then finally, the fourth is what is the setting? What is the sociocultural context in which the speaker embeds this narrative, right? And I would add here that what we know about politicians often and what we know about sort of human behavior um, is that anecdotal evidence is often a very strong part of these narratives, right? But this can be really problematic and often leaves space for distortion or propaganda, especially from a science perspective, right? Where science gives very little attention to individual actions or behaviors or events, right? We're looking for broader, grand theories, right? But politicians love to use these sort of idiosyncratic, anecdotal evidence. And I would point out, at least contemporarily, in the last year or so, is the Laken-Riley Act, right? An act of violence and murder of a U.S. citizen by an illegal immigrant, right? And the right has did use this uh, as sort of exemplary of all immigrants, right? But that's troubling. And so you can see this play out where the right sort of uses this idiosyncratic individual example of violence to say that like crimes and violence is inherent in illegal immigrants. While the left basically is trying to make this aggrandized argument that, you know, immigrants on the whole, when we're not looking at individuals, sort of add to the tax base, uh, increase economic growth through in the aggregate, right? Um, and so I think this is a good example of how sort of an idiosyncratic event gets turned into a narrative, uh, and often it's really hard for citizens, everyday average Americans, or whatever you might be. Um, to sort of see the bigger picture sometimes, right? And this is, in a lot of senses, this is where education allows you to sort of filter information and think about bigger pictures and things like this. But politicians tend to know that using these idiosyncratic events can really turn the narrative for their own benefit, right? And this is just one suggestion. I'm not suggesting the left doesn't do this because the left absolutely does this too, right? I just wanted to sort of offer a contemporary example of how these things play out in reality and the different narratives that coalesce from different groups, right? So, okay, that's all I got for you today, or at least for lecture 15. I'll get the final lecture up here in just a minute. Thank you all so much. I'll see you soon.